All right, let's get going. So my job is to provide an overview of the topic emergent literacy. How many of you are going to be putting in an application that's focused on early childhood? Okay, and so that's the period of life that encompasses what we call emergent literacy development. And so my job is to get us on the same page as to what emergent literacy in an early childhood setting looks like as a backdrop to your application, right? Does that make sense? I'm not writing your application for it. We're not writing applications today. It's about background knowledge to facilitate you putting in the best application you can. Okay. I have 150 minutes. Well, now probably about 140. I really struggled with this talk because I wanted to get as much as I could in so that the content was effective, but that's not very much time. My goal is to provide an overview of emergent literacy in the context of the simple view of reading, talk about 3 emergent literacy domains that are highlighted in the state comprehensive plan. Because your plan has to align with the states, my thought was you're going to be attending to these 3 domains in your application. That's my take on things. And then I'm going to give you examples of evidence-based practices you can use that align to those topics. Okay? You will have my slides. Eventually, I'll send them to Melissa. We'll get them online. And you'll see my email is on the front slide. I'm at Ohio State University. I absolutely don't mind questions, but the longer your email, the more likely it is I won't respond to it. So the short, like, hey, can you send me that article? Those things are easy for me to react to, but if you write paragraphs like, help me understand this, it just goes to the bottom of my pile. Make sense? But I do welcome your follow-up questions. Okay. So starting with number 1, an overview of emergent literacy in the simple view of reading. You probably saw this slide yesterday. Does this look familiar? Maybe? I stole it from Melissa's presentation. In the Ohio Comprehensive Plan focused on literacy, literacy development is viewed as a continuum. It is a developmental accomplishment that begins with birth in what we call the emergent literacy period of development. So we can think of a child's life as child's born, and for the first 5 years, give or take, we say they're an emergent literacy period of development. Typically, when kids transition into kindergarten, in Ohio, God, I'm like in your face, aren't I? When kids transition into kindergarten, we say that they begin to learn to read formally. It's variable across Ohio. What happens in kindergarten classrooms, some kids only go part-time to kindergarten depending on what district you're in. But this is when we think reading development begins in earnest, when kids begin to be taught. And usually, there's a transition about, when is this transition?
3rd grade.
What is it?
3rd grade.
3rd grade. And in Ohio, we guarantee that all kids will be fluent readers by that transition point, which is after 3rd grade. Okay? It's the law that in Ohio, kids will be able to read fluently by the end of 3rd grade. And then we say kids are in a conventional literacy phase in which they're reading to learn across the curriculum, and then we move into what we call adolescent literacy. So today is all about this early period emergent literacy. What's really interesting about this is this didn't used to exist. We didn't view kids before kindergarten, 1st grade as developing as readers. So only about 20 years ago did people genuinely begin to study and think about literacy in young kids. Okay, so this is pretty new, 20 years. All right, so This is hopefully a retrospection of what you learned yesterday. But before I proceed, I want to talk about what reading is in the first place and make sure we are absolutely on the same page. So, everybody read that. You can do it silently. Okay? So you just did the thing that we want all kids to be able to do. That's our goal for all kids in Ohio. What did you do? What is reading anyway? You should know the answer based on presentations yesterday. So you just did what we want all kids to do. What is it you did? What is reading?
Recognize the words.
Okay. I don't have I do. Okay, you said recognize the words. Okay? So you looked at this and you recognized it. What does that mean? You decoded it. What does that mean?
Took the smaller parts.
Yes.
Put together to create.
So what you did is you took these symbols, which are called graphemes or alphabet letters. You looked at these and then you linked them to sounds. And I'm pointing here. This is all happening in your left hemisphere. And you mushed together those sounds to arrive at a word that has meaning. Baby. I'm lying a little bit because you didn't actually decode these words. Because you are skilled and fluent readers, you read every one of these words on sight. These are sight words for you. You have read every one of these words so many times that you actually process them completely automatically. You do not decode. But when you are beginning to read as a child, you are actively decoding every single word because you don't know them on sight. Okay? So you mentioned that you had to decode these words or recognize the words. That's part of reading. What's the other part? You need to understand it. Okay? And in fact, decoding these individual words, it's a means to an end. It's irrelevant that you could decode the word baby. That's a means to an end, which is reading all of this and understanding it. Okay? So when Joseph was a baby, his grandfather made him a wonderful blanket. The ultimate goal of reading is to be able to get a picture of that text in your head. Okay? So this should be familiar to you. The simple view of reading. It says reading is the product of two things and two things only. Decoding and comprehension. And this comprehension is language comprehension. It's language. Okay? This simple view of reading has been quibbled with. A lot of people say, is it really just those two things? What about motivation? Okay? And we can quibble, it's okay. But this is a really good start. And if you're an early childhood educator, how many of you are early childhood teachers? Okay. How many of you are program administrators? Okay. Who's everybody else?
Intervention specialist.
Intervention specialists?
Building
Any-
administrators.
Literacy specialist.
Literacy specialists?
Program specialist.
Program specialists? Okay. So in early childhood education, what I'm going to talk about today is this gets us started. If you can put foundational practices in your classrooms in place that support the precursors to this and this, you're 5 steps ahead. Okay? So the simple view of reading is a really good starting point. Okay? So the key to the simple view of reading is recognizing that you have to be able to decode the words and you have to be able to comprehend them to build a picture of the text in your head. So can you read this? Maybe someone in this room can? Who can? No speakers of Arabic. Well, that's a problem because we have a lot of Arabic speakers in Columbus, so why are they not in the teaching profession? But this is in Arabic, and nobody here knows the letters of Arabic. Safe assumption? So you cannot read this, okay? But the reason you can't read it is because of this, okay? So your lack of knowing the code for Arabic keeps you from being a reader, okay? Who can read this? Okay, so you speak English and Spanish, so she's bilingual. What does this say?
Columbus is a beautiful city.
Yes.
Very beautiful.
So Columbus is a very beautiful city. Do you agree? Excuse me. It's my home, sort of. Although I went to anybody from Cleveland? I went there a week ago. It's so beautiful. But we're still better. Not that I'm competitive. So you can, for this is Spanish, so technically, even if you don't speak Spanish, and a lot of you probably don't, you can decode this. So raise your hand if you don't know Spanish at all, not a lick. Okay. So you could be fooled into thinking you can read this because you can decode it. You can decode it, but you can't comprehend it. Okay? So for you, if you don't know Spanish, but because Spanish and English share the same letters and sounds, you actually have a window in. You can decode. You don't comprehend any of it. Okay? We actually have a lot of kids in our schools who are in 3rd or 4th and 5th grade and 6th grade who are kind of like you when it comes to reading Spanish. They know how to crack the code because they've been drilled to death, but they don't have the vocabulary to comprehend. So they could sit and read this, and then you say, what does that mean? And they can't tell you anything. So, and I'll talk a little bit more like that about that because we're tempted to think these kids are readers, and they're not. Does that make sense? Okay. So to bring this full circle, reading is the product of decoding or word recognition. Those are synonyms, unless you study reading for a living. But for everybody else, they're synonyms. And comprehension is a synonym for language skills, okay? So we're going to move forward from here. Any questions so far? Okay. So when we think about kids in schools by 3rd and 4th grade, any child who's struggling as a reader, we can think about what's the core issue here, okay? Are you a poor decoder, or are you a poor comprehender, or are you both? So we have a lot of kids who by 3rd grade are good decoders and good comprehenders, and we call those typical readers. This is our goal for what percentage of Ohio kids? 100%, period, okay? Period. How are we doing? Not good, okay? If you look at some of our urban school districts like Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, well over 50% of kids are not here, okay? Then we have this group of kids. They're poor decoders but good comprehenders, and we typically call that dyslexia. You cannot say a child has dyslexia until they've had many, many, many opportunities to learn to decode. Does that make sense? So we can have kids in 3rd grade who can't decode, but they were never explicitly, repeatedly taught to decode. So kids have to have the opportunity to learn how to decode in the context of instruction, and then they can't decode, and we can say, okay, you actually have a problem with decoding. Does that make sense? Then we have these kids who don't get a lot of attention. These are kids who can decode well, but they don't understand anything they read, okay? This is a group of kids who commonly falls through the cracks. So these are kids that go to a school that has adopted a really good basal reading program with a heavy emphasis on decoding. So they go through the drills. They learn how to decode, but there's not enough attention given to building the language skills that allow for good comprehension. Does that make sense? And then we have kids who are poor decoders and poor comprehenders. globally impaired readers. One of the things to think about all of these is, for most kids out there who are in these categories, they're not there because of something innate. They're there because we're failing them as a society and educationally, okay? So take a kid, I work in the Wineland Park neighborhood here in Columbus. I interact with a number of families who bring their kids to the center I work in. So you have a child born into a home. There's no dad in the picture, there's just a mom. She's working at Burger King, barely getting by. She's stressed, she's depressed, she doesn't know how to interact with her kid very well. They can't get the child into a quality preschool, so the child works into kindergarten way behind. And because the child is poor, they're more likely to go into a chronically underperforming school, where the teachers are stressed, under-equipped, and maybe there's not a good curriculum in place. So kids aren't born to be like this. We're doing this as a society to our children, okay? And one of the reasons you're all here, one of the reasons I'm here, is because we want to play a role in fixing this, a little tiny role. Every one of us can do one little tiny thing, and we can try to fix some of these circumstances. Okay. One of the things that's crucial here is that when we have a child who's in 3rd grade, let's just take Juan. Juan's in 3rd grade in Columbus City Schools. Suddenly, it's the spring of the year, and Juan fails the 3rd grade reading assessment. Does this happen? Yeah. Is it serious? Yeah. Juan, we knew he was going to fail. We knew he was going to fail 4 years ago, based on his performance on screening assessments and development of critical predictors of reading success. We knew this several years ago, or we should have. All the tools are there. We should have done something, because all these kids out there who get to 3rd grade and fail the Ohio State reading assessment, the circumstances that set them up to fail were apparent years prior, okay? And what we see very consistently is these kids who aren't adequate readers at 3rd grade, if we go back in time, go 4 years back, they have delays in critical precursors to reading success. And we're going to talk today about print knowledge, phonological processing, and vocabulary. This is something we have studied repeatedly, those of us who do research in this area. Researchers more or less have a crystal ball in their hand, because we do longitudinal studies and we say, oh, this is what kids look like at 4, who's going to be a poor reader, and we can actually have really good foreshadowing based on kids' skills. Does this make sense? So we're in the early childhood space. When we think about reading in young kids, what are we going to do? This is complicated because little kids, I don't know if you figured this out yet, they can't read. I don't know if you know this. Have you noticed this? They can't read. If you study reading in young kids, it's a little bit of a conundrum because we're interested in studying something that they can't do, and we don't actually want them to do. We don't want 4-year-olds to be reading. We want 5-year-olds to be teasing with reading. By 1st and 2nd and 3rd grade, we want them to be developing as readers. So this is crucial. It is crucial. If you hear me talk and you forget everything I've said, just remember this one thing. We're not teaching little kids to read. We're putting in place the precursors that will allow them to be successful in their future. In kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. We're putting the precursor skills in place. Does that make sense? So don't go back to your early childhood program and go buy some 1st grade reading program and start doing that with 3 and 4-year-olds.
But you started with kindergarten.
Sorry, what?
You started with kindergarten.
Right, you start, I did. So that would be okay. Most, are you saying I contradicted myself?
Well, the precursors, we're trying to put together the precursors in place, but you said you didn't mention preschool, early childhood. I'm just asking.
Well, we're putting precursors in place in early childhood, what I would say birth to 5, to ease children's transition to what comes next, which to me, in my head, is usually kindergarten, but not always, because it's very, very local. Okay? My model that I operate from in my head, which may not apply everywhere, is that in a typical situation, kids move into kindergarten, they're in a K-3 language arts curriculum. Okay? But we have to be aware that that doesn't describe every circumstance. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what's in my head, but understand there's a lot of deviations from that. In my head, though, typically I think formal reading instruction is from K-3. Okay, so when I talk about emergent literacy in early childhood, I'm talking birth to 5, AKA transition into formal schooling, kindergarten. So what are we going to do? Are we teaching little kids to read? No. Could we? Yeah. With a bunch of M&Ms and simple books, we could get kids to memorize. I mean, we can do this with gorillas. We can teach them to read some simple things. That's not what we're doing. Put the M&Ms away. Sorry, I always say I can teach anything with a bag of M&Ms, but we're not teaching things well with a bag of M&Ms. What we want is to develop deep competencies and motivations, okay? So when we think of little kids, you know, they're only this high, right? When we think of 3 and 4-year-olds, if we're not teaching them to read, what are we teaching them? What are the precursory skills that they will draw upon in kindergarten and 1st grade? What are those things? What skills do we observe in young children that are foundational to future reading?
Being able to orient the book the right way.
Okay. I just came home from Mexico last night at 11 p.m. And I got this book, Estamos en un libro. I don't know if you know Mo Willems, but Mo Willems, my favorite book by Mo Willems is We Are in a Book. How many of you have read the book We Are in a Book? I dug around early this morning, I wanted my English version, so I found the Spanish version in Mexico City. I was very excited. Okay, sorry, that was beside the point. We want kids to be able to orient books appropriately, and I'm using a Spanish language Mo Willems book. We want kids to be able to orient a book. What else do we want?
Emergent storybook reading.
Say that again?
Emergent storybook.
She said emergent storybook reading. What is that?
It's where they use the pictures and storybook language that they've heard to read.
Okay, I'm going to call that pretend reading, without quibbling over why. So we want kids to be able to tell a story emulating the way we tell stories, which really indicates that they know how a book works and they're internalizing the structure of books. Yeah?
We want to read to them when they're really young and also work on writing.
Okay, I'm gonna grab the second part of what you said. Not work on rhyming, because we're not talking about what we're doing, but what skills do we see in kids, and we often see kids by 3 and 4 years of age making up rhymes. Okay? That's something we see kids do. What else do we see kids do?
Phonics and letter recognition.
She said phonics and letter recognition. Let's break those in half, 2 totally different things. What is letter recognition?
Recognizing key letters that may be in their name
Okay.
or in signs.
So it's really knowing that's an L. Okay? We have 26 letters. And for each of those letters, kids need to do 2 things. They actually need to do more, but in the preschool years, what they're doing is developing a recognition of the visual characteristics of every letter. Okay? And they actually, as you know, letters have 2, they have an uppercase and a lowercase, so they're recognizing And they put a name to it, okay? So part B of what you said is phonics. What is phonics?
Matching the sounds to the letters.
I got $5 for the person with the right answer. What is phonics? Phonics is a teaching approach, okay? Phonics is we'll talk more about that. Phonics is a teaching approach where you explicitly teach the relations between sound and symbols. Phonics is not a skill that kids have. Okay? It's not something kids do. It's a teaching approach. Yeah.
Environmental print. Young kids
Thank you.
recognizing McDonald's.
So we want kids, there's so many things embedded in her reference to environmental print. So lots of 3- and 4-year-old kids are walking around and saying, oh, that says McDonald's, that says Walmart, that says whatever. What they're doing is they're learning that print carries meaning, and they're learning how to decode in a way that's really superficial, okay? Yeah?
Carry on conversations.
Mm-hmm. That's a biggie. So having back and forth conversations that are multi-turn. Yep. Yes.
Phonological awareness.
Yeah, phonological awareness. So kids are showing a sensitivity to the sound structures in language, and we'll talk more about that. So when we think about developing reading and literacy skills in an early childhood setting, we are helping kids develop the precursory knowledge and skills that future reading instruction is going to rely on, okay? So I have a 15-year-old daughter who's very close to learning to drive, okay? When she begins to drive, think about beginning to drive as formal reading instruction. She's going to go through formal driving instruction, right? We're not there yet. But what are the skills I want her to have that she's going to draw upon to be a good driver? What are some of those? Patience. Anger management. Hand-eye coordination. The one I'm most scared about is self-control. Space relations. Yeah. So if, as a mom, I'm super afraid of distracted driving. Anybody who has a teen, it's distracted driving is very, very scary. So I'm trying to put the precursor skills in place to help her not get distracted. That's what I'm focusing on. And that's the same thing as you in early childhood. You're not teaching phonics. We'll talk more about that. But you're teaching the precursory skills that are going to be crucial so children succeed in kindergarten and onward. Okay, so when we think about early literacy in a young kid, what does it look like? Okay, these are my 2 kids when they were very young. This is the soon-to-be driver. So she's about 6 and he's about 2, and they're sitting in bed and they're both reading. And so this is the continuum of reading development in these early childhood years from 2 to 5. They're both sitting and looking at books. They're like an old couple, aren't they? But what does early literacy look like? These are some pretending to write, pretending to read, which I think is what you were alluding to. I mean, look at him. You think he's reading that? No, but he's sitting there turning the pages. Naming letters, reading print in the environment. You mentioned this. Writing your own name. Lots of kids by age 4 are writing their name, and they're very proud of that. Asking questions about print in the environment, asked to be read to, and other things you said, like taking part in conversations, being inquisitive. So keep this in mind. As you go back and you develop your comprehensive literacy plans for early childhood, be really careful that you don't start to teach kids to read. Okay? That's not what we're doing with young kids. We're building the foundations. Yeah?
So when kids get to kindergarten and they don't have these foundational skills and they weren't exposed.
We're getting there. So her question, what's your name? So Lynn's question was, so kids walk into kindergarten and they don't have these foundational skills and 20 others, right? First of all, is that a reality? Yeah. What happens? What happens? So there's two things. Well, we're going to talk more about this, so I'm just preluding this. So this is really, really, really tricky, okay? So kids who walk into kindergarten and don't have any of these skills, so let's put it this way. Who's in a school district? Okay, what's your school district? Okay, she's in Cleveland. So let's say you're in an elementary school building with 3 kindergartens. Okay, so you got, 75 little 5-year-olds, okay? And 20% of those kids, what's 20% of 75? About 15? Okay, about 15 kids come in, and they don't know any of these things, okay? One of the things we know from research that follows kids is those kids in the bottom 20th percentile at kindergarten, what happens to them? They stay there. So if you go find those kids in 3rd grade, they're still at the bottom 20th percentile, okay? So that's why kindergarten readiness is such a hot topic. Kids who walk into kindergarten and are not ready, AKA can't do these things and other things, they don't tend to move out of that position. Okay. Now, you said something really interesting. What's your name? Susan. Susan said something very interesting because we said, what happens if you walk into kindergarten and you don't have these things? She said, well, we teach them. Yes, we do, and there's a couple challenges regarding that. Number one, we're teaching some kids these very rudimentary things that other kids learned at 2 and 3 years of age. So they're not getting beginning reading instruction. Okay, that's why they stay behind. The other thing that's really interesting right now, this is kind of an aside, but across the United States, we're doing massive investments in early childhood education, right? If anybody from Dayton, okay, rapidly expanding preschool access. Anybody from Cincinnati? Rapidly expanding preschool access. You're for Clee, rapidly expanding preschool access. It's happening all over the US. And we're getting really good at providing high quality early education. So kids who come from high quality preschools, they have all this. They walk into kindergarten. The challenge is if you have kids walking into kindergarten and you have too many kids who don't have these things, kids who are at high quality early childhood, they just plateau because the teachers are teaching below them. And so early childhood effects wash out. Does that make sense? So what we have to work towards as a society, just even as members of a state, is having every child walk into kindergarten with all these skills. Somehow, some way. Okay. So what does early literacy look like in a young kid? Yes, I'm being repetitive because there's a lot of misunderstandings about what early literacy looks like in young kids. It does not look like going out and buying Jolly Phonics and having kids do tracing letters and, okay? What does it look like? It looks like stuff like this. This is a 2-year-old child in an early childhood setting. And this guy, his name is Coleman, and he drew a picture and signed it, okay? I don't know what Coleman's doing now. This was in 2011, but I think there's a 99% chance he's a very good reader. Why do I say that?
Precursory skills.
Because what?
Precursory skills, so he's going through the...
Because he's 2. What does he already know? Tell me 3 things you know he knows. What? Number 1, Susan, print has meaning.
Symbols make that.
Number 2, print is a specific symbol system.
It's appropriate to sign things that you know.
Number 3, he is using print to claim ownership. Okay? He's 2. He also understands that words are made up of discrete symbols, okay? This kid is not a genius. He might be. He could also be perfectly average. He could also have Down syndrome. Lots of 2-year-olds can do stuff like this. Who are they? Kids who have been exposed. Exposed to what? Marijuana? Exposed to what?
Kids who've been exposed to different types of literature, speaking and...
Kids who are supported to develop these precursory skills. Go into an infant toddler classroom and look for opportunities for kids to write. There's not too many of them out there. People are too afraid to give markers to kids because, yeah, they write their name and then they shove them in their mouth. But as long as it's not toxic, it's fine, okay? But we're really reluctant to push literacy on young kids who are 2 years of age, but this is a typical capability, okay? This is my own kid. I'm just showing you, he's written the letter T twice, and he's really proud of that. Knowing his letters and playing with this symbol system. So when we talk about literacy in young kids, this is what we're talking about, okay? Okay, any questions? Yeah?
You had said something earlier that matches the data we're seeing in my system. I just want to clarify. You mentioned about when you have too many kids lacking the precursor skills that preschools have no effect before they cap.
Yep.
What we're seeing in our CRAE data is 75% of our kids are not demonstrating reading readiness, and preschool matters not. If the kids are in preschool and those are not, really are not showing any difference in data.
In fall of kindergarten?
Fall of kindergarten.
So in fall, where are you?
Start counting, fairly slowly.
Oh, yeah. So in fall of kindergarten, you take all your kids and start counting, wherever. And you look at so you take kids, preschool attenders and non-attenders, and you compare them. You find no difference. Okay, so I have 5 follow-up questions that I'll just ask right now, and we won't talk about it anymore except at break. Number 1, tell me what preschool looks like. Is it full day? Is it half day? Is it every day? Some of these preschools, like state-funded preschool dollars, it's for 2.5 hours a day. No literature out there suggests that's useful. It's not we need full day, high quality, ideally year-round preschool for kids. So number 1, what does preschool look like?
Half day.
It's half day. And half of that is transition and pottying, and so you can do something with it, but number 2 is we need to look at exactly what's happening inside those 2.5 hour days, because it could be completely devoid of high-quality literacy supports, which is why your plan is going to be crucial. Okay, those are my 2 starting questions. Oh, the other thing is, I think number 3, and this is really tricky in Ohio, when you say non-preschool attenders, what actually were they doing? Because very few of those kids that we call non-preschool attenders are actually sitting at home in front of the TV. They're in some sort of other type of preschool setting. So we need to find more about that. Okay. 5 fundamental premises. You ready? And then we're moving on. These are things that are true, and you need to know. Okay, number 1. Preschool kids' language and literacy skills are consistently predictive of future reading. Okay? What does that mean? It means that if you're all 4, and I give you a test to figure out which of these things you can do, or even a subset of them, okay? So you're all 4. Let's just give you an alphabet measure, okay? I test every one of you, and I find out how many of 26 letters you know. Some of you will get 26. Some of you will get 0, and some of you will be somewhere in between, okay? If we take a simple measure like that, and I give it to you today in Stark County, and I come back when you're in 3rd grade, how you did 4 years earlier on that measure is going to be highly related to how you look as a reader today. Okay? Do you believe me? You have to, because I'm not making this stuff up. And you can write me later and say, you got my email and say, I totally disagree with you. I don't think these skills matter. Give me your source and I'll give you my source, okay? Source says. So when we think about early literacy in young kids, we often think about skills they're developing that are precursors to D in the simple view. And we call those code-based skills. Okay, does that make sense? So there are some skills that kids are developing in preschool that are important to their future success in the D part of the simple view, like alphabet, which we'll talk more about. Knowing the alphabet at age 4 and 5 is positively related to future decoding. Okay? We call those code-based skills. Skills we're teaching young kids that help them crack the code. Then we have meaning-based skills. These are early skills that help kids be better comprehenders. We call those meaning-based skills. So if I go to a conference, I just went to one last week, if I go to a conference with a bunch of reading researchers and you walk around, this is everyday jargon. A study of code-based skill development in preschool settings. Meaning-based skills that precede future comprehension. These are common terms. Does that make sense? And it's a way of thinking about the early literacy skills in terms of how they relate to future reading. So code-based skills, meaning-based skills. Both are important to future reading. How do we know that? Well, unless you're really into structural equation modeling, you don't want to know the details, okay? But I want you to understand how we know these things. This is a typical, what we call a longitudinal study. I just finished one of these. You go get actually we just started another one. You go get a bunch of kids. How many? The study we just started last year is 400 kids. We enrolled them. They're from Central Ohio. We enrolled 400 kids who are all in preschool. And for your interest, we have kids who are in preschool and kids who are not. And it was very hard to find the kids who are not. So in longitudinal work, like we're doing here, you go and you get a bunch of kids. And in this study, this is more than 10 years old, they got kids who were 3 and they gave them a measure of language. Okay? Then when they were 4 and a half, they gave them a measure of language, general language, vocabulary, phonological awareness, and alphabet knowledge. Okay, so they go get all 400 kids, 1,000 kids, and then you go and find them again, and here they give more measures, and then here at grade 3, they give a reading comprehension measure. Okay? If you want to do longitudinal research for a living, this is what you do. Get a bunch of kids, give them a bunch of measures, and follow them over time. Don't lose them. Okay? Don't lose your kids. And then what you do really, it's not that simple, but then you look at like, oh, are kids who have better language at 3 better reading comprehenders at grade 3? Those are the kind of questions we ask. And what we find over and over and over and over is skills beget skills. What's that mean? Skills beget skills. If you have skills, you keep accumulating them at a more rapid pace, okay? So these kids who have better language here are much better readers here. You have to believe this or it's not worth going to work every day. You have to understand that what you do today matters, and it does. Let's take it to Ohio, okay? Does it matter if kids have literacy skills when they come into kindergarten? This is a study we did a couple years ago when we had the earlier version of the KRA, the KRAL, a very, very simple measure that teachers gave to kids when they showed up for kindergarten. I think 26 items that were like, how many letters do you know? Can you rhyme? A very simple measure. So we used data from a bunch of kids in Central Ohio, and this is their fall. So what you have, well, don't worry about the details yet. We knew how they did at kindergarten, and if they were in what was called Band 1, which is really not ready, you're doing really badly at kindergarten entry. So we have Band 1 kids, Band 2 kids, Band 3 kids. Kindergarten entry, how old are these kids? They're 5. 26 items. How long does it take to give this? About 10 minutes. Okay? Then fast forward, spring of 3rd grade. How long into the future is this? It's simple math.
4 years.
About 3.5 years, give or take. Okay? 3.5 years, that's a long time. Okay? And this is if they passed or failed the 3rd grade reading assessment. So let me ask you this. Let's see, this is like you haven't taken one of these questions on a test for a long time, right? So if a child in Ohio bombed Band 1, had very limited literacy skills when they walked into kindergarten at age 5, what's the probability they're going to fail the 3rd grade reading test? Tell me. 2/3. So you're a mom or a dad, okay? You have a 5-year-old, it's your baby. And you get back to kindergarten. Now, we don't use this measure anymore. It's a shame. But your child's in Band 1. You call the teacher and the principal, and they're like, oh, don't worry about it. They'll catch up. What's the chance they're going to catch up? Less than 1/3. Okay? So does this matter? Yeah. Look at this. What if your kid walks into kindergarten? Again, you're a mom, you're a dad. Your kid walks into kindergarten, and they ace that kindergarten readiness assessment. They ace it. What's the likelihood they're going to pass? No, let's do it the other way. What's the likelihood they're going to be a bad reader in 3rd grade? Less than 20%, less than 1 in 5 chance, okay? So what this is telling you, whether you're a practitioner, an administrator, a parent, a researcher, is that early skills matter. Kids who walk into kindergarten and they do really well on all these kind of cheap indicators of literacy skill, they're able to soar through beginning reading instruction. They thrive. And when it gets to OAA, it's a breeze. Okay? So don't ever forget, if you're an early childhood teacher, if you're a parent and you're an administrator, when you walk into these early childhood classrooms, what you're doing is really important because you're contributing to this. And this is what we call the achievement gap. Okay? This is what we call the achievement gap. We have a bunch of kids who fail the 3rd grade reading assessment and can't read, and a bunch who can't. Okay, and unfortunately we have a lot of kids who are overrepresented in that test failure. Poor kids, minority kids, recent immigrant kids, kids with disabilities, the achievement gap. Okay? All right. Number 2, so key understanding number 1 is these skills actually matter. So the next time you have a dinner party and you say, oh, I'm an early childhood, and somebody at dinner says, oh gosh, we're just pushing down kindergarten into preschool. These kids don't need to know all this stuff. You can say, well, actually, longitudinal studies suggest the opposite. Okay? Number 2, children, this is sort of a repeat, but children who walk into kindergarten who have well-developed skills, they're going to thrive. In fact, if you go back to the previous slide, there's a 1 in 5 chance they're going to have problems in their future. Okay? Once kids get into kindergarten, they're very stable. They're very stable. So we desperately want kids at the end of their time in preschool to be able to write their name. We desperately want them to be playing with print. This is hard to see, but what you have here is a kid in preschool has made a grocery list. And can anyone read it? It actually says banana, apple, apple. Okay? We desperately want kids to do these things. Because your little going on kindergarten kid who does this, I mean, there's so many things this kid knows that they're going to take with them. What are 5 things this kid knows? Eat your fruits.
Left to right.
He understands left to right, top to bottom. He understands the purpose of print. Okay? He knows a lot of letters. He's linking, he's sitting there trying to write the word apple. It's like E-P-E. He's like, oh, nice try. Okay? He totally gets a thumbs up for trying. This kid is taking so much knowledge into kindergarten. Number 3, some kids are vulnerable for not having these skills. Okay? Certain groups of kids. Kids who are reared in poverty. 1 in 4 kids in America. Not in poverty, but they're in a low-income home. 1 in 4. Anybody in this room who's like under 40, this is the future of our country, okay? You should care, I'll be dead, but this matters to the future of our economy and our reliance on a skilled workforce. Poverty has huge effects on kids' early literacy development. Having a disability does too, and a lot of times we think that kids who are bilingual are at risk. Kids in this country who are bilingual are not at risk for literacy problems. Bilingualism is an asset. But it is, in this country, it is conflated with poverty. Okay? So if you have a kid in your school who's bilingual and from El Salvador, there's a high probability they came here perhaps even as a refugee, and there's a lot of odds against them, and we should be worried about these kids. When you have a kid in your classroom who's like English Dutch, you're not so worried about that kid because it's probably 2 professors' parents or something. So don't ever be fooled into thinking bilingualism is a problem, ever. There's really good research showing that people who are bilingual have better working brains than people who are monolingual, okay? The problem in this country is most of our bilingual people live in poverty. Okay. This is a study we actually just published of kids in Ohio's Appalachian region. Actually, it wasn't even just Ohio. I think it was Ohio, West Virginia, and Virginia. Kids in kids from low-income rural homes. Anybody from a rural setting? Oh, good. You travel. So kids entering kindergarten in rural schools in Appalachian counties. Okay? I can't remember how many kids it was, 600 or 700 kids. And we looked at their kindergarten readiness in the fall of the year across multiple domains: language, literacy, early math, social emotional, and what we call learning related behaviors. Really the ability to conduct yourself appropriately in a classroom setting. And what we have is 4 profiles of kids and how they did across these multiple measures. So these are groups of kids, okay, who showed a certain profile. So look at this profile. This yellow profile is called ready. These are kids who are absolutely ready for kindergarten. Tell me about them. How are they doing across these skills? Look at them in comparison to all the other kids. Okay, these kids, if you look at these yellow kids, they're performing really highly on all these things. So they have good language, good literacy, good math, good social emotional, good learning related behaviors. Now, study this whole slide very carefully and tell me what percentage of kids in these kindergartens were entering ready. The data's in the table. How many?
About 25.
Here. Okay. 1 in 4 kids were here. Okay? What we should be today we're talking a lot about language and literacy, so look at these 2. So we're really interested in this. These 2 groups of kids are doing poorly. Does this make sense? If this is really good and this is kind of average, these 2 kids are underperforming in these areas, these 2 groups. What percentage of kids are in this purple and red profile?
50.
Where did you get that? Who just said 50? Where did you get it? Okay, so the purple group of kids who are called academic risk, there's 1 in 3 kids were in that group. They had really poor language and literacy, but they're good on the social emotional. And then you have this red group, look at these kids, and you had 16%. So these two groups of kids are underperforming at entrance to kindergarten. Now these are real kids. These are kids we're working with as educators in Ohio. If you're working in Appalachian kindergarten programs and you're looking at the kindergarten readiness of kids walking the door, what percentage of kids are going to struggle with that transition? What percentage? Half. Okay, half. So what would be amazing is if you all wrote these amazing comprehensive literacy plans for early childhood and these kids went away. I mean, the kids still exist, but we'll move them out. This doesn't happen anymore. Are you an optimist? Is it possible? It is. It just takes a lot of work and vigilance, and everybody marching to the same tune.
So what about the green line? What happened to them with the
Oh, this is an interesting group of kids because these are kids who have really good academic skills, but what? They have social emotional issues. And unfortunately, now this is a little bit of an anecdote. I'm actually trying to work on this problem from a researcher lens right now, but I think these kids, well, these kids too, I think these kids take 80% of teachers' attention. So I call it the 80-20 rule. 20% of kids in a classroom get 80% of teachers' attention. And who are the kids who get the teachers' attention? The kids who you want them to stop touching other people and rolling on the floor, trying to escape. So this is a really interesting group. And they're important because this is not a conference at all about social development. But a lot of these kids who have poor behaviors in their classroom, they start to be victimized by other kids and rejected. And that can have a real host of negative consequences in kids' future. Okay, 5 key understandings. We're on 4. I'm beating a dead horse right now. Okay, is that a saying? Okay, good. I'm just going to talk about this really quickly. So these longitudinal studies, what we find is that kids who have early delays, so to speak, in developing these skills, it has lifelong consequences. How do we know that? Well, this is a study I did quite a while ago. These are kids at 4 and a half who have language disabilities, okay? Kids with language disabilities and then kids who have typical language compared in their reading growth all the way to 5th grade. Tell me what you see. What do you see? Tell me 3 things. Okay, number 1. Okay, start with 4 and a half years of age. Number 1, we see that. See this? What's that? Okay, at 4 and a half, kids with language disabilities have lower, I should clarify, this is a measure of literacy. This is literacy into reading. They have lower literacy skills than kids who have typical language, right? Number 1. Number 2, what? Number 2, the gap never goes away. And number 3, what do you see at 5th grade? It is actually slightly widened, and other people who have done this with a bigger data set show that this actually gets bigger. That gap never goes away. Okay, once kids go into school, I've already mentioned this, kids are very stable. If we say most of these kids are at the bottom 20th percentile in literacy development, they tend to stay that way. And I always say, why be surprised? How many of you are in the bottom 10th percentile right now on the spring marathon circuit? But you come in at the last 10th percentile. Okay, we have the Columbus Half Marathon in a couple months. You got 1,000 people, and we're taking the bottom 10%, which is what 100 people. How many of you would be there if you went and ran? Okay, So then let's say you're in the bottom 10 percentile in your half marathon time, and I went, and 4 years from now, you do the half marathon again. How many of you are going to stay right there? Yeah, or get worse. You're going to get worse. It's the same thing. People are stable. Okay, we're stable. But this is something we need to do something about. Hence, all the money that's come to this state to support striving readers is because of this. Okay. Number 5, we, in early childhood, our goal is not to teach reading, it's to prevent this. It's prevention. Okay? 20 years ago, our government put out a report about the prevalence of reading problems in this country, and they said the only way we can truly put a dent on this is through prevention. Hence the title of the book, Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children. This is a government report. They convened the finest experts around the nation to contribute to this, and they said we really need to invest in early childhood. So it's been 20 years, and I've been studying early literacy for actively since 1996. This came out in 1998, and I can't tell you how different things are as someone who's been in this space as an academic. 20 years ago, nobody studied this. I was like the only one. Now, everybody studies it, okay? We didn't have measures. We didn't have conferences on literacy in young children. There was so much we didn't know or do. Yeah?
What ages is early childhood officially?
I always say birth to 5. That's when I say that. And the idea of preventing, it really was focused on birth to 5. That if we start trying to correct reading issues in kindergarten first, it's too late, okay? All right. So to bring it all full circle, you saw this yesterday. 20 years ago, this was barely on the radar. And now, when the state of Ohio gets a pile of money to focus on reading, birth to 5 has a space in that agenda. That's crazy. That's crazy, okay? All right, okay. So I think this is my way to sum up everything. Are you ready? Okay. This is time. This is time. This is, let me back up and tell you, this is a metaphor, or maybe a simile. You decide. So reading is like a braid. Is that a simile or a metaphor? That's a simile. Okay. So this is kids at 3rd grade. They're a skilled reader, semi-skilled. They are fluently able to decode and understand. Okay? Now go back in time. This is early childhood, birth to 5. What you're doing, what's going on is kids are developing a whole bunch of discrete skills. Like vocabulary, grammar, background knowledge, inferencing, phonological processing, print knowledge, early writing, motivation. They're developing all these discrete skills that when the time comes, they're going to call on them in the integrative act of reading. Okay? So think about my daughter learning to drive. She's driving, right? She's cruising down 315. She's calling upon self-regulation. She's calling upon eye-hand coordination. She's calling upon patience. She's calling upon her understanding of the rules of the road. Does that make sense? Your early childhood educators, here's your focus. You're not teaching reading. There's a lot of skills that kids call upon. But in the Ohio State plan, they heavily emphasize 3. So I bolded those. Vocabulary, phonological processing, and print knowledge. These are heavily emphasized. I would say those 3 skills are necessary, but not sufficient for skilled reading. They're necessary. Gotta work on these in early childhood. but they're not sufficient. There's other things that we'll need too, like interest in reading, motivation. Okay. So those will be our focus for the rest of our morning. So to bring it all home, we have the simple view of reading, and we have precursors to the D, print knowledge and phonological processing, or often referred to as phonological awareness, and then we have vocabulary as a precursor to C. So what we're going to do, we're going to take about 5 minutes, and when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time going through each of the